What if everything you've been told about cholesterol is wrong? Imagine this: your doctor panics over your high LDL, but your arteries are spotless. Your inflammation's gone, and you feel better than ever. In this video, we're exposing why the numbers your doctor fears might actually mean your body is healing. So let's talk about when clinical reality contradicts medical consensus. A patient walks into a clinic with elevated LDL cholesterol. Traditional medicine sounds the alarm, but the coronary artery calcium score shows zero plaque. Triglycerides are low, HDL is high, inflammation markers are optimal. The patient reports feeling better than they have in decades. The numbers say danger, the body says health. This contradiction sits at the heart of the carnivore diet debate, revealing something deeper than dietary preferences. It exposes how medicine decides what counts as evidence, who gets to interpret it, and what happens when patient outcomes challenge institutional consensus. The measurement problem. Medical science spent $2 billion proving the diet heart hypotheses. The idea that saturated fat causes heart disease became gospel, shaping dietary guidelines for generations. Then the foundation crumbled. A 2024 meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials found no significant evidence that reducing saturated fat prevents cardiovascular disease or mortality. 9 trials, 13,532 patients, and the conclusion was clear. Current recommendations cannot be justified by the data. Yet physicians continue warning patients away from high-fat diets based on cholesterol numbers alone. The disconnect runs deeper than outdated guidelines. It reflects a fundamental problem in how medicine evaluates metabolic health. Traditional markers like LDL cholesterol were designed to predict population level risk. They work as rough approximations across large groups, but they fail at the individual level, especially when metabolic context shifts. Consider what happens on a carnivore diet. Patients often show elevated LDL. Conventional interpretation: increased cardiovascular risk. But when clinicians look beyond cholesterol, they find something different. Fasting insulin drops. Triglyceride to HDL levels improve dramatically, often falling below 2. High sensitivity C-reactive protein levels decline. These markers reflect actual metabolic function, insulin sensitivity, and systematic inflammation. Most striking, coronary artery calcium scores remain 0 or very low despite elevated LDL. The calcium score measures actual plaque buildup in arteries. Research shows that people with 0 CAC scores have only a 0.5% rate of major adverse cardiovascular events. The body isn't accumulating damage, it's adapting. But medicine trained on population averages struggles to interpret individual metabolic adaptations. The tools were built for a different purpose, measuring different populations eating different diets. So what happens when theory meets clinical reality? The gap between theoretical risk and observed outcomes appears repeatedly in clinical practice. Take HbA1c, a standard marker for blood sugar control. One patient followed a strict carnivore diet showed progressively higher HbA1c readings. Traditional interpretation: worsening diabetes risk requiring intervention. Except the patient's daily glucose readings stayed stable around 80. Right? Fasting insulin was low. C-peptide levels indicated excellent insulin sensitivity. The patient felt energetic, mentally clear, with no symptoms of metabolic dysfunction. So the elevated HbA1c was a mathematical artifact. The test assumes standard red blood cell lifespan and glycation rates. Change the metabolic context, and those assumptions break down. The lab suggested disease while the body demonstrated health. This pattern repeats across multiple markers. Folate levels may appear low on paper without functioning deficiency. Lipid profiles shift in ways that look alarming through conventional lenses but reflect benign metabolic adaptations. The challenge: distinguishing genuine problems from adaptive changes that simply look abnormal. And why did they look abnormal? Because the labs are built on a whole lot of sick people. Okay? And so normal for sick people is not normal for someone who's metabolically healthy. Clinical symptoms provide the keys. When patients thrive despite abnormal labs, when energy improves, when inflammation resolves, when autoimmune symptoms disappear, the body is communicating something lab values miss. A Harvard study surveyed 2,029 adults following a carnivore diet for a median of 14 months. Right? Contrary to theoretical concerns, participants reported few adverse effects and high satisfaction. Notably, 93% were motivated by health reasons, not athletic performance or body composition. These weren't gym bros chasing trends. They were people with chronic health conditions seeking solutions after conventional approaches failed. The clinical observations accumulate. Patients with inflammatory bowel disease achieve remission. Type 2 diabetics normalize blood sugar without medication. Autoimmune conditions improve or resolve entirely. Real-world outcomes that challenge theoretical predictions. So, why consensus persists despite evidence? If patient outcomes contradict theoretical concerns, why does medical consensus remain skeptical? The answer reveals how institutional forces shape scientific understanding. The Heart Association and National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute controlled cardiovascular research funding for decades. Influential researchers shaped priorities. Editorial boards and conferences, dissenting voices faced funding cuts and publication barriers. This concentration of power created what critics called a heart mafia. Institutional credibility became more important than scientific objectivity. Once the diet heart hypothesis was enshrined in federal policy, bureaucratic structures made reversal nearly impossible. The same dynamics affect carnivore diet research today. Researchers studying alternative dietary approaches struggle to secure funding. Publications favor studies supporting conventional paradigms. Clinicians avoiding this specialized diet risk professional marginalizations. Clinicians advocating for specialized diets risk professional marginalization. Sorry about that. The bias isn't necessarily malicious, it's structural. Medical education emphasizes plant-based nutrition and dietary variety. Guidelines reflect decades of accumulated assumptions. Pharmaceutical interests, big pharma, align with managing chronic disease rather than preventing it through nutrition. Follow the money. Okay, changing course requires admitting past errors. They'll never do that, you know. Institutions resist that admission. Meanwhile, the standard American diet continues failing millions. Obesity rates climb, type 2 diabetes become epidemic, metabolic syndrome affects a growing percentage of adults, cardiovascular disease remains a leading cause of death, and cancer rates are continuing to climb dramatically. The safe baseline that carnivore critics invoke isn't safe at all. It's a documented failure, producing widespread chronic illness. So, what is the dilemma that you, a patient, is under? This creates an impossible situation for you guys, right? Someone with autoimmune disease tries conventional dietary advice. Symptoms persist or worsen. They experiment with carnivore and experience dramatic improvement. Energy returns, pain subsides, labs show better metabolic markers. Then their doctor warns that they're risking their health. Oh my God, you're going to have a heart attack eating nothing but meat. Ha! Okay, the warning is based on theoretical concerns and population level guidelines of people who aren't carnivore. These patients lived experience contradicts it. Who do they trust? Who do you trust, right? Most dietary paradigm shifts happen bottom up, driven by patient experimentation rather than practitioner recommendation. People try approaches that conventional medicine dismisses, find they work, and seek medical support afterward. This pattern reflects medicine's lag time. Clinical practice evolves faster than institutional consensus. Patients become catalysts for change, forcing practitioners to reconsider assumptions. But navigating this gap requires patients to become their own advocates. They must track symptoms, monitor biomarkers, educate themselves about metabolic health, and find clinicians willing to interpret data in context rather than reflexively applying population based guidelines. The burden shouldn't fall on sick people trying to heal, yet that's where institutional inertia places it. Because it's a lot easier to look at labs, not in context, but against the population, and trying to get you to be sick like the rest of the population rather than personalizing the medicine to your individual metabolic needs. Okay? What stronger evidence actually requires? Critics note that long-term data on carnivore diet remains limited. Most patients have followed the approach for 2 to 5 years, not 15 to 20. The caution is reasonable, but it misses the comparative context. You're not comparing carnivore's unknown long-term effects against a proven safe baseline. We're comparing it against conventional dietary approaches with well-documented failure rates, right? Yeah, why do you want me to eat the standard American diet? So I can be sick like everybody else? Ask that to your doctor if they question you about carnivore. The question isn't whether carnivore is perfectly safe, it's whether it offers better outcomes than alternatives for specific populations with specific conditions. Answering that requires different research approaches. Long-term randomized controlled trials remain valuable but insufficient. They're expensive, slow, and struggle with real-world adherence. Nutritional research needs methodological diversity. Smaller mechanistic studies can illuminate biological pathways. How does eliminating plant compounds affect gut inflammation? What happens to insulin sensitivity on a meat-based diet? How do lipid particles change composition and behavior? Prospective observational studies can track patient cohorts over time. Current research using coronary CT angiography is monitoring plaque development in carnivore and ketogenic populations. Early data suggests plaque progression may be slower than conventional models predict. Patient-reported outcomes deserve elevation as primary endpoints, not secondary measures. Symptom resolution, quality of life improvements, and functional health changes matter as much as biochemical markers. Most importantly, evidence standards must recognize metabolic individuality. Some people thrive on carnivore diets. Others don't. Everyone's different. Genetic predispositions, baseline metabolic health, and lifestyle factors create variation. Okay? The goal isn't providing one diet that works for everyone. It's understanding which approaches work for which people under what conditions. Okay? But that doesn't mean that we don't understand basic cellular biology, cellular adaptation, and the mechanistic functions of the cell, which tell us that a ketogenic diet, very low in carbohydrate, or a carnivore diet, have lots of things that are positive for it for almost anybody. Not everybody, but almost anybody. And the only way to really tell sometimes is to try it for a while. Try it for 6 weeks to a year. Okay? You'll be surprised. Okay, structural changes medicine needs. Shifting institutional consensus requires more than waiting for data. Research funding needs diversification. Reducing reliance on government and industry bodies with entrenched interests would allow investigation of alternative approaches. Independent investigator-initiated studies should receive more support. And that's why there are now new groups coming out, like the Citizens Studies on Nutrition, where they're funding it themselves and not going through a pharmaceutical company or a big ag company, a big food company. Okay? Funding agencies should prioritize negative and null results. That's the whole idea of the scientific method, is look for negative results so you know what doesn't work. Don't try for positive results, because you'll never get them properly, okay? Especially for nutrition. Publication bias toward positive findings distorts the evidence base. Knowing what doesn't work matters as much as knowing what does. Conflict of interest management needs strengthening, big time. Stricter disclosure requirements and transparent data sharing would build trust. Guideline development panels should include diverse expertise without financial conflicts. Medical education must evolve beyond rigid hierarchies that treat long-term RCTs as the only valid evidence. Clinical observation, mechanistic insights, and patient experience provide complementary knowledge. Interdisciplinary collaboration among geneticists, microbiologists, and clinicians can integrate diverse data streams. Professional culture needs to reward critical thinking over dogmatic adherence to outdated guidelines. Continuing education should include emerging dietary paradigms and honest discussion of existing evidence limitations. These changes face resistance. Institutions protect their authority. Consensus provides comfort. Admitting uncertainty threatens credibility. But patients are already moving forward. They're experimenting, sharing experiences, building communities around alternative approaches. Clinical practice is adapting to accommodate them. The question is whether institutional medicine will catch up or continue defending positions that patient outcomes increasingly contradict. And I go back to follow the money and ask that question again. Reframing risk itself. The carnivore diet debate ultimately forces a deeper question about how medicine thinks about risk. Traditional risk assessment focuses on avoiding potential harm. And that sounds good, right? Don't eat too much saturated fat. Don't eliminate entire food groups. Don't deviate from balanced dietary guidelines. But this framework only made sense when it was developed because they didn't know enough. But it assumes the status quo is safe, and that's the big thing. That conventional approaches provided a neutral baseline from which deviations carry risk. That assumption no longer holds. Okay? For someone with severe autoimmune disease, the risk isn't trying an unconventional diet. The risk is staying on the conventional approaches that aren't working. Every day, symptoms persist, represent ongoing damage, diminished quality of life, and potential disease progression. For someone with metabolic syndrome following standard dietary advice, the risk isn't elevated LDL on a carnivore diet. The risk is continued insulin resistance, inflammation, and progression toward type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Risk assessment must be comparative and individualized. What are the alternatives? What does the patient's current trajectory look like? What does their body tell us through symptoms and functional markers, not just lab values interpreted through population-based reference ranges? Medicine, trained on population averages, struggles with this personalization. Guidelines work across large groups but fail individuals whose metabolic context differs from the norm. The solution isn't about abandoning guidelines. It's recognizing their limitations, severe limitations often, and developing frameworks for personalized interpretation. When a patient shows elevated LDL but zero coronary calcium, excellent triglyceride-to-HDL ratio, low inflammation, stable glucose control, and dramatic symptom improvement, there's not a warning sign requiring intervention. That's a body adapting successfully to a new metabolic state. The measurement problem isn't just about which markers to track, it's about understanding what those markers mean in context, how metabolic adaptations alter their interpretation, and when to trust patient outcomes over theoretical predictions. The path forward. Scientific consensus will eventually catch up to clinical reality. It always does. The saturated fat hypothesis took decades to unravel, despite weak evidence. The carnivore diet may fall. Oh, by the way, it's not just weak evidence, it was actually falsified evidence, right? And I've done multiple videos on how the saturated fat hypothesis was based on faulty data that was actually falsified. The carnivore diet may follow a similar trajectory, moving from fringe to acceptance, to accepted therapeutic option for specific populations, to be much more acceptable to the entire population. But patients can't wait for institutional consensus, right? How long are you going to have type 2 diabetes waiting for the institutions to agree that maybe you shouldn't have it and the way to get rid of it is not to eat carbs? Okay? So think about that. How long do you want to be sick? There are things you can do, you can try that will help. They're dealing with chronic illnesses now, seeking solutions that work for their individual metabolic context, right? That's what you should be working on. What you need or what they need, these people looking to move forward, are clinicians willing to monitor appropriately, interpret data in context, and support personalized approaches rather than reflexively applying population based guidelines. What medicine needs is humility about knowledge gaps, openness to clinical observations that challenge theory and dogma, right? Let's not forget these guys are built on years of dogma, which is not based on reality, and structural reforms that allow evidence from diverse resources and sources to inform practice. What research needs is methodological diversity, long term tracking of patient cohorts, which is very expensive and hard to do. Okay? But it would be very helpful if they could do it. Mechanistic studies of metabolic adaptations, right? And elevation of patient reported outcomes as primary measures. Now, one of the reasons you will not get mechanistic studies of metabolic adaptations is there's nothing to patent with that. Think about it. I'm going to do a study. I'm going to get 3,000 people together. I'm going to feed them a carnivore diet, and we're going to look at, does their metabolic health improve? I can't patent eating meat. There is no pharmaceutical company that's going to fund that. It's not going to happen, right? So we have to be well aware of the limitations there. The carnivore diet debate isn't really about one dietary approach. And carnivore is not just a single diet. It's a spectrum of diets, including ketogenic on one side, which is very low carbohydrate to no carbohydrates, all the way to carnivore, which is just nothing but meat and animal fat. Okay, it's about how medicine responds when when clinical reality contradicts institutional consensus, how we evaluate evidence when conventional markers don't capture the full picture, and whether we can build systems flexible enough to recognize that metabolic individuality requires personalized solutions. Patients are already answering these questions through their choices and outcomes. The question is whether medicine will listen. All right, I want to thank you for going through this and listening here. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the appropriate section in the video, right? We try to answer every question appropriately. Also, if you haven't done so, please think about subscribing to this channel, liking this video, and sharing it with somebody. It helps us a great deal. Thank you. And go ahead and it helps a lot of other people. And finally, if you haven't thought about it, I do have a group coaching program. It's only $10 a month. The link will be in the description. Think about looking it over. See if there's something that's worthwhile for you. Okay, it's not that much for what I hope to be a lot of good information for you that is very personalized to your needs. Thank you.